7 disturbing entities, 3 categories, and 1 tier list to rank them all. From Trevor Henderson to SCP, there are plenty of disturbing entities, each with their own unique ways of making us glad that they don't actually exist. I'll be ranking each on fear factor, rarity, and finally, at the end, I have an overall ranking of which ones are hardest to survive. This is the disturbing entity survival tier list. Now, this being is often mentioned few and far between even in Trevor Henderson content, including in my own videos. It just kind of blends into the background compared to other entities that might be more disturbing, such as Cartoon Cat. But that's actually the exact point of who this entity is. And most of the time, you wouldn't even notice if it was there. A New Year's Eve party at an Air Force base in 1943 where a man was fatally injured, a car accident in 1948, and a disastrous train accident in 1951. It's interesting to note that no matter how close he gets to other bystanders, no one ever recalled seeing him at the time. It is only in looking at the photos after the fact that he's seen. Standing at about 5'7", the man possesses very similar features to a normal person. That is, until you take a closer look and realize that the skeletal structure of the man's entire skull and facial features is completely reversed. Throughout the 1900s, the man was sighted all throughout the world, being primarily in the US and Europe. Unlike the widely known and beloved long horse, the man with the upside-down face brings only suffering and disastrous effects with him. But since he is invisible until photographed, you will likely never know when one of these is going to occur. But it does seem that he might either purposely or accidentally reveal himself to children, as he knows that most of the time they will go unbelieved, and the disastrous effects will likely be written off as a freak accident, when in reality it couldn't be more of the opposite. So the question is, where does the man with the upside down face fit into our tier list? Well, first, let's go into how exactly our ranking system is going to work. Typically, a tier list is measured S through F on certain qualifications, and in this case, we will be ranking on fear factor, rarity, and then finally at the end, once we have all the options laid out, survivability. In terms of fear factor, the man is on the less scary side based on looks alone, but the fact that he tends to be invisible but still able to interact with people in reality is uniquely unnerving, especially when re-looking into pictures before tragic events and realizing he was always there. But I would still give the man at most a B tier in terms of fear factor. When it comes to rarity, he is technically seen worldwide, but it is suspected that after the source of these many tragedies, after the 60s, he has almost disappeared, appearing less and less and eventually not at all. To be honest, I think this could mean one of two things. Either he has a period of dormancy similar to something like Pennywise, or he simply is getting better at remaining unphotographed. So in terms of rarity, in present day, he is a solid C tier. Dating back to the biblical times, 2 men said in the book of Genesis to be born of Adam and Eve both possess their own unique skills. They would then understandably use those skills to make offerings to God. However, when one of the offerings was more than favored than the other, an envious nature would then form in the farmer Cain towards his brother, and he would murder Abel. Fast forwarding thousands of years to the modern times, a black stone cube would then be randomly discovered somewhere in Mongolia, surrounded by corpses of humans likely to have died there before eventually this cube was taken under the jurisdiction of the SCP Foundation and brought back to one of the facilities. In a very similar circumstance, another event was observed in New York, but this time it was a male, seemingly of Middle Eastern descent, found surrounded by bodies of many violent gang members. For research purposes, he too was also brought to the facility. They were given designations 073 and 076. The black cube mentioned before was later identified and discovered to have another male living inside of it. However, once he was discovered, he promptly would awaken and enter a sort of rage state, killing all the members around him and forcing a lockdown of the facility. And before he could be thoroughly studied, he had to be put down by the facility guards. Confused on this whole circumstance, researchers would go and interview 073, who stated that he not only knew who this person was, but it was his brother Abel, and that he in fact was the ancient figure Cain. He would then eerily end the interview with stating that his brother was nowhere near dead. The official logs for SCP-076 reads as follows. In the event of a full breach, all on-site staff are to proceed immediately to the closest security station for weapons and armor distribution. Should 90 minutes pass after declaration of full breach without a stand-down order being given by level 4 or higher personnel, final contingency measures will be activated, flooding the entire facility in seawater and sealing off the access shaft for a minimum of 24 hours. This will, by necessity, result in the death of all on-site staff. It is obvious that the abilities that 076-2 possesses are anything but human, and once he does eventually resurrect, he seems to be given first priority in making sure he is shot and killed again and never is able to escape the facility. With this being said, fear factor is not too high for this one, as 076 could simply be seen as a roided up serial killer. So I would just give him a C when it comes to fear factor and a D when it comes to rarity, as you would likely only encounter him as personnel at the facility, or in a rare case if he somehow manages to escape. Now the worst part of this next entity is the fact that it could happen to anyone around you. There's no limit for the range of this thing, nor is it stated how often an event like this could happen. And if it did happen, you likely would never really understand why. It would start with the victim just simply acting a little bit off, and then they would start to decline mentally and then eventually physically until they would become something that you don't even recognize anymore, and it would start aggressively attacking everyone in sight. And unfortunately, at this point, they belong to him now. This creature is known as the Unspeakable. Despite being not currently present in the universe, it has managed to manipulate a number of people into joining a cult known by the Eternal Order of the Second Death, and appears as a blob of red flesh with a single eye inside of its mask. Among assumably many other things, the Unspeakable is able to possess people with ease, as well as dispatch multiple of its demons into reality in the form of its followers or simply random children of its choice. When being possessed, you are shown to rapidly deteriorate mentally and physically until you become somewhat of an entity yourself. Some being obvious, others only appearing in bursts or when needed by the Unspeakable. Now, the full abilities of this entity is not quite ever shown. However, if you or someone around you somehow becomes possessed, it seems like an extremely intricate process in order to fix it that most of the time ends in them dying anyways. Even in the game Faith, this entity is never really killed, just simply defeated and sent back to its own domain, which means there's always a possibility of the cult coming back in some form and bringing it back through into our reality. When it comes to fear factor, I would say the Unspeakable is a terrifying concept, even though the pixelated form is not much for menacing, but this is just a representation of what it would actually look like. And if it was brought into real life, seeing your close friends or family members being possessed, or worse, knowing you could be, and suddenly your actions would not be your own, is definitely worthy of a high rank, making it at least a solid A on the fear factor scale. As for rarity, it seems to be able to be anywhere at any time and doesn't quite have a limit, especially if you live in one of the towns with a high cult presence, so it's going to be our first in the S category for rarity. If you suddenly were to fall into a world that was an infinite emptiness and almost seemed like a poor imitation of our reality, you would think at that point you'd be living with the worst possible kind of fear, but you would be wrong. Rather, the worst feeling in the world is when this previously thought emptiness turns out to be not so empty, but rather the level you're on has become home to one of the most disturbing entities that I've seen while researching this place. And all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, a four-legged, almost shadow-like creature, with the only part of them visible being the front of their skull, crawls out of the ceiling and rushes you down with relative ease, running at a speed of over 50 miles an hour, and when catching you, being able to crush you immediately and drag your corpse back into the ceiling from where it came from. Your only hope in a situation like this would be to quickly break line of sight for long enough that it loses track of you and moves on. Alternate versions of this creatures can also inhabit level -6 and horrifically can infect you with a radiation sickness, and you don't have to be a genius to figure out how that would go. This version also is able to burrow under the ground rather than in the ceiling. All species of memory have the ability to detect you from over 100 feet away, so no matter what level you encounter these things on, it will not be easy to escape. So how do we go about placing the memory? As for fear factor, these things are definitely scary in their abilities, but again, not the scariest thing visually. Not that I wouldn't be terrified if it was sitting right in front of me, but I'm gonna go ahead and put it on a C tier for fear factor. In terms of rarity, it is unknown the amount of levels they inhabit here, but they seem to be more common than just on one level, so I would say C across the board. You know, sometimes living conditions can be hard enough by itself, but this gets even worse when living near Hamilton Forest. Labeled by police as the exclusion zone, citizens are heavily suggested to never go inside. However, since the area is so big, people end up accidentally or more purposely wandering in anyways. It is then immediately classified as a lost cause. No search parties are dispatched, and families are urged not to go in themselves. This, however, doesn't stop many, and they will end up being added to the list of assumably deceased persons. So, what is the deal with this exclusion zone? While doing my research, I noticed most of it consists of forests and valleys, but there lies a facility built an unknown amount of years prior, assumably to study the phenomenon of this zone. Inside lies an undetermined amount of corpses and bones of people who assumably strayed too close, along with many notes, one in particular stating, "Upon entering the exclusion zone, individuals are immediately at risk. Evidence shows the chance of them being affected by the phenomenon is linked to their distance from what is currently thought to be the centermost point of the exclusion zone. Satellite imagery shows that this area contains an unexplored cavern located within the eastern region of Hamilton Forest. All attempts to reach the cavern have been met with failure." Now, according to this, no one really knows what this cavern looks like or what it holds. But to reference how dangerous this zone actually is, this facility is located on the very edge of the exclusion zone and it is completely devoid of human life. So I can't imagine what this cavern really holds inside. Despite there being no signs of workers present, scrapes and footsteps are heard throughout the facility. When entering the main computer location, a disturbing array of what looks to be dismembered torsos skewered on metal poles. On the computer, we see what is likely the final words of the facility employees before succumbing to the phenomenon, begging for emergency assistance. However, something clearly has changed, and despite typing in the correct authorization code, the camera shows that this is indeed no longer an employee, and we see a familiar face yet again. This is the glimpse of the entity behind the exclusion zone, appearing as an amalgamation of faces assumably belonging to the previous victims. The worst part of this is not only does this mean that the goal of this thing is to attract more people, but when it absorbs them, it also gains their knowledge, as it was very familiar with the employee auth code. I'm also kind of led to believe that on top of being absorbed into this thing, people beforehand, when first being affected by the phenomenon, may begin to mutate horrifically before eventually entering the main mass of flesh. And inside of the facility, we see a photo that kind of illustrates how this looks like. Regardless, there seems to be an 100% death rate inside of this zone, and whether this is due to the entity itself, or if the phenomenon has more than we thought, is unfortunately unknown at this point. When it comes to rating this phenomenon, fear factor is close to the top, being around the same as the unspeakable, sitting at an A tier, but I would say low A tier. As for rarity, it exists only in this single exclusion zone to my knowledge, so it would be a D for rarity. But if you do enter this zone, there isn't a 100% chance that it will find you. Now, to me, the most horrific part of DDLC obviously wasn't how it looked. Rather, it was that no one could have expected how bad it was going to get by the end of the game. People, including myself, were traumatized enough just playing the game. I couldn't imagine what it would be like actually living it. The premise of this is simple. You join a club and try to get closer with one of your 4 classmates. You were encouraged at first to choose based on your preference, but for some reason, 3 of them seemed to jump out more than the 4th. Monica always seemed to be almost intentionally sidelined, but at first this wasn't necessarily obvious. Despite who you choose to get closer to, they all begin acting weird. Sayori begins to act distant and empty. Yuri begins to be obsessive to a level way past creepy. And Natsuki malnourished and possibly even abused. And this comes to a head when Sayori doesn't show up to school and you find this note instead. I'm gonna be honest with y'all, this game messed me up as a kid, so disclaimer, this contains self-harm, depression, along with slight gore. You can feel free to skip to the next timestamp if you are uncomfortable with this, I completely understand. With that being said, unusual from typical Sayori behavior, she does not greet you at her door. She is not downstairs, and despite you walking in, there is still no response. "Wake up, dummy" is the last words uttered from our main character before a gruesome scene is revealed. Sayori is found deceased in her bedroom, unfortunately by her own hand. Distorted music plays in the background, and understandably our character has a mental breakdown, followed by him suddenly ending up back in the club, like nothing happened. Soon after, it is revealed that Yuri harms herself with a knife out of an obsession for you, and eventually reaches the point where she too stabs herself in front of you, followed by the same pattern as before. Except, In the case of Natsuki, she simply just seems to snap and then disappear on her own, just leaving Monika, who now admits to being in control of all of this, manipulating all the other girls to their deaths. So now it would be just you and Monika. The world around you is so broken and distorted that you now just exist in one single room with the very same person responsible for all of their deaths. Regardless, Monika at the end of the day isn't too scary here, but the events she caused were absolutely horrific. So I'd put her on a low C, with Rarity honestly being a difficult one, because in this universe it technically controls the entire world. So it is technically an S and an F at the same time, so I'll just put non-applicable for this one. For our last entity, you may be more familiar with its counterparts being Amber, the follower, or most popularly the boiled one, but there is one entity that is the most anomalous out of all of them and rarely even covered or researched. In fact, its creator, Dr.Nowhere, states that he even named himself after this creation. We can assume this one might have some connections to the other ones, but overall it is unknown. Rather than immediately attacking its victims, the Doctor is specified to stalk individuals and can move at will. The only known sighting of this creature as of now occurred on a farm many years ago during a photography session of a local family upon their plot of land. Nothing seemed too out of the ordinary until a figure similar to him until they noticed there was something foreign inside of one of their photos. It is unknown that if due to the low light foggy condition that it was just simply not noticed when the photo was being taken, but upon looking at the photo, everyone immediately looked, only for the Doctor to promptly disappear shortly after being spotted. Since then, many people have reported while walking alone at night hearing disembodied voices and paranoia, followed by a brief sighting of the being, and then in days following these encounters, disappearing altogether, but oddly leaving all their belongings behind. Regardless of whether these were related, I would say the Doctor is an S-tier fear factor. There's no denying that Dr. Nowhere is seriously talented at drawing super disturbing content. As for Rarity though, I would give it a low C because it doesn't state how these events happen, but I would assume it would be frequent enough to be a problem. Now that we have all of our entities laid out, it's time to start ranking them in the survival category. Starting with the man with the upside down face, he seemingly possesses an almost unreal amount of power, along with being for the most part invisible. Trevor Henderson himself even states that he is in the too late category in his own tier list, and he can be anyone on the planet, but then there's also the fact that he hasn't been seen in a really long time, so we're not really sure if he still exists. Regardless, I think an S tier is appropriate, as if you do encounter him, you're not going to survive. As for SCP-076 and 073, they are mostly kept inside containment, but if you were face to face with one, especially 076, he would likely kill you. On the other hand, he simply only possesses superhuman strength and speed, not necessarily durability, but it is shown that he can be killed. So with reasonable means of defense, I would put these SCPs B tier. The Unspeakable, basically being a version of the devil, obviously possesses unimaginable means of making sure you don't survive. And for the average person, this would be far too much, and they would quickly succumb to possession or worse. So I'm going to be putting this as our second S tier. Now looking into the memory, the Backrooms in itself is its own unique hell, and the memory, if encountered, would make things so much worse. And I feel like your death would depend on what level you would encounter it on. Twists and turns slow it down heavily, and it would give you a chance to escape, and if you manage to get out of line of sight, it would quickly forget you and move on. But since it comes down to random chance, the memory is going to be going in A tier. Next up, we're going to be going on to the exclusion zone. While it is a very, very rare encounter, the people who would wander in often didn't know well enough, or they didn't have much of a choice, as they either wandered in out of stupidity or they went to track down a missing family member out of desperation. Once you're inside, you are guaranteed to die, so this would be an S tier as well. Now, if you're actually inside of the DDLC universe, Monika is essentially like a cyber demon that can control all the code in the game, which is basically their whole world. So if she wanted to kill you, she probably could. And if this was your perspective, watching all the people you just met die in front of you, including one who is considered to be your best friend for most of your life, it would be horrific. Technically, if you are playing as the main character, rather than dying, you would just be trapped for eternity in this void. So since you're technically surviving, just not in the way you would like to, Monika's survivability is technically an F tier. Now for our final one, we have the Doctor. As stated previously, we don't have a lot of data, and we don't really know how many victims survived and how many died. We just know that the photographer would disappear weeks after his encounter, and assumably was taken and killed. But giving the Doctor the benefit of the doubt, I'll give him a B tier. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you disagree with any of my rankings, make sure to let me know down in the comments, as well as telling me some internet horror entities you would like to see added in a part 2. Well, that was quite an adventure.
I'm sad to see you go, but don't worry, this doesn't have to be the last time we see each other. I got another cool video. Just for you. Hurry, the video's almost over.